Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever found yourself deeply captivated, even obsessed by someone? Perhaps it was a fleeting encounter, or maybe a prolonged connection that seemed to consume your thoughts and actions. The question is, why does this happen? Why do we sometimes find ourselves unable to break free from the grip of another person's presence, whether physically or in our minds? Today I want to explore this complex dynamic and delve into why we become obsessed with others beyond mere attraction or infatuation. The first reason we become obsessed with others lies in something called projection, specifically the projection of our unconscious selves onto them. We all possess parts of ourselves that remain hidden, tucked away in the recesses of our minds. These are the traits, desires, and qualities we may feel uncomfortable with or unable to express. Perhaps it's a burning desire for freedom, creativity, or self-expression, traits that we feel we cannot fully embody ourselves. When we encounter someone who seems to personify these qualities, we project our unconscious needs onto them, elevating their presence in our lives to an almost mythical status. It's not them we're obsessed with, but the parts of ourselves that we see reflected in them, those parts we have yet to fully embrace. The second reason for obsession is rooted in unmet emotional needs and the powerful pull of archetypes. Each of us carries with us emotional longings, whether they are for safety, approval, or companionship. Sometimes in our search for fulfillment, we gravitate toward people who represent these unmet needs. Imagine the maternal figure or the hero figure, the archetypes that sit deeply within us, representing qualities we yearn for. When we encounter someone who embodies these roles, it can feel as though we found the missing piece of our emotional puzzle. Our obsession, in this case, is a desperate attempt to fill a void we've carried for far too long. It's not the individual themselves, but the symbolic role they play in our emotional lives that draws us in so intensely. And then there is the matter of the shadow self, the unconscious parts of ourselves that we are often reluctant to face. These are the traits we deem unacceptable or uncomfortable: anger, jealousy, fear, or vulnerability. When we see these aspects reflected in someone else, we are drawn to them, not out of love, but out of the need to confront and integrate those parts of ourselves we have denied. The obsession becomes a mirror to the darkness we have yet to acknowledge in our own soul. And in obsessing over them, we are, in a sense, trying to make peace with the shadow within us, hoping that by understanding them in another, we can better understand them in ourselves. So why are we obsessed with certain people? Because on a deeper level, our obsession is not merely with the individual themselves, but with the parts of ourselves that we see reflected in them. We become captivated by our own projections, our unmet needs, and our unacknowledged selves, hoping that through another we can unlock the mysteries of who we truly are. The concept of projection is a powerful and often misunderstood force in human relationships, and it plays a significant role in why we become obsessed with others. Projection occurs when we ascribe qualities, traits, or characteristics to someone else that actually belong to ourselves. This psychological phenomenon is not limited to positive traits, but extends to negative ones as well. Projection can occur in both conscious and unconscious forms, and often we are unaware that we are projecting our internal world onto another person. When this happens, we tend to develop an intense connection with the individual, sometimes to the point of obsession, because we see in them something that resonates deeply with something inside ourselves, though we may not recognize it at first. At its core, projection serves as a mechanism by which we can externalize the parts of ourselves that we either do not understand or do not wish to confront. These projections can manifest in both conscious and unconscious forms. In the conscious realm, we may see traits in others that we admire or wish we could embody. For example, if someone is confident, outgoing, or articulate, we may find ourselves drawn to them, perceiving them as having qualities that we feel we lack. This could spark admiration and even obsession as we begin to focus on that person in an attempt to understand how they possess these traits or how we might embody them ourselves. However, the unconscious projection is far more insidious and powerful. It occurs when we project parts of our psyche that are darker or more difficult to acknowledge onto others. These may be qualities that we repress, such as anger, jealousy, fear, or insecurity. Rather than dealing with these uncomfortable emotions or traits within ourselves, we externalize them, transferring them onto others. In doing so, we create a distorted image of the person we are obsessing over, an image that reflects not who they truly are, but who we believe them to be based on our own inner conflicts. This unconscious projection can lead to unhealthy and sometimes obsessive relationships. We may fall in love with someone not because of who they are as an individual, but because they represent something in ourselves that we are afraid to confront. In many cases, we might idealize the person, seeing them as perfect because they reflect the very qualities we long to embody. Our obsession then becomes an unconscious attempt to possess or understand the very parts of ourselves that we are not comfortable facing. An example of this can be seen in romantic relationships. Many times when we fall deeply in love with someone, we believe it is because of their personality, their looks, or their achievements. But often it is because they possess characteristics that we feel are lacking in ourselves. Perhaps we see in them a sense of self-assurance, an ease with social interactions, or a strength that we feel we do not have. These qualities, though outwardly attributed to the other person, are deeply connected to something within us, something we wish we could express but have suppressed. As a result, we may fixate on them, unable to separate our admiration for their traits from our desire to see those same traits reflected within ourselves. In contrast, projection can also occur in more negative forms. We may project our own unresolved issues or darker emotions onto others, which can create tension, conflict, or even obsession. For instance, someone who struggles with feelings of inadequacy may find themselves drawn to someone who appears overly confident. However, instead of seeing their confidence as a positive trait, they may interpret it as arrogance or superiority, which then fuels their obsession with trying to understand or challenge the other person. In this case, the projection is not one of admiration, but one of projection of our own unresolved feelings of inferiority onto the other person. The more we fixate on them, the more we may feel a sense of rivalry, competition, or even hostility. In some instances, projection can be tied to a deep psychological need for approval or validation. If someone has a deep-seated need for external validation and is unable to provide that to themselves, they may project this need onto others. They might become obsessed with a person who represents the qualities they believe will give them the validation they seek. Perhaps someone who is successful, admired, or loved by others. The obsession comes not from a genuine connection with that person, but from the belief that if they can somehow win that person's approval or affection, it will validate their own sense of worth. This type of projection can be particularly dangerous because it often results in toxic relationships where one person is treated as an object to fulfill the other's unmet emotional needs. Another example of how projection plays a role in obsession can be seen in the way we deal with our own fears and insecurities. If we have unresolved feelings of fear or vulnerability, we may project those fears onto someone else. We might become obsessed with someone who we believe is threatening or dangerous, even if they have not done anything to suggest that. The root of this obsession lies not in the other person's behavior, but in our own unresolved feelings of insecurity. We create a narrative in which the other person becomes a symbol of our internal fears, and our obsession with them is an attempt to deal with or understand the fear that we cannot face within ourselves. The process of projection can also create a distortion in the way we perceive the person we are obsessed with, because we are projecting our own unresolved issues or desires onto them. We see them through a lens that is not objective, but rather colored by our internal conflicts. This distortion can make it incredibly difficult to see the other person for who they truly are. We may convince ourselves that they are a perfect match, our soulmate, or someone who completes us, when in reality we are simply projecting our own fantasies, desires, or unacknowledged traits onto them. This can lead to disillusionment and heartbreak when the person does not live up to the idealized image we have created in our minds. One of the most interesting aspects of projection is that it is not always negative. Sometimes projection can serve as a gateway to self-awareness and growth. When we project something positive onto another person, it can reveal to us what we value, desire, or aspire to become. However, this is only possible if we are willing to engage in introspection and recognize the projections for what they are. Without self-awareness, we risk remaining trapped in the cycle of projection, obsessing over others without understanding the deeper motivations driving our feelings. The key to breaking free from the grip of obsession driven by projection is to acknowledge and confront our unconscious desires, fears, and unresolved emotions. Self-awareness is essential to understanding why we are drawn to a particular person and what they represent in our inner world. By examining our projections, we can begin to understand the parts of ourselves that we have neglected or denied, and this understanding can lead to greater emotional freedom. When we stop projecting our inner world onto others, we can begin to form more authentic relationships that are based on genuine connection rather than the distorted lens of our own psychological needs. Unmet emotional needs play a central role in the way we experience relationships, particularly when it comes to the intense feelings of attachment or obsession we may develop towards someone. Human beings are inherently emotional creatures, driven by a vast array of desires, fears, and needs that shape how we interact with others. These needs are not always obvious or easily articulated, yet they often guide much of our behavior and influence the dynamics of our relationship. The quest for emotional fulfillment is at the heart of many human interactions. And when we encounter someone who seems to offer a solution to those unmet needs, we may become deeply drawn to them, sometimes to the point of obsession. This can be understood through the lens of emotional hunger, a longing for connection, nurturing, validation, or protection that, when not fulfilled, leads us to seek it in external sources. As we search for someone who can meet these emotional needs, the obsession grows, because the emotional void we are trying to fill feels vast and consuming. The nature of unmet emotional needs is complex because they vary from person to person. What one person may crave, such as reassurance or affection, another may not. Some individuals may have an unmet need for deep emotional intimacy, while others might be seeking admiration or validation. These needs are often shaped by early childhood experiences, cultural influences, and past relationships. For instance, individuals who grew up in environments where emotional support was scarce or inconsistent may find themselves unconsciously seeking relationships that provide the care and attention they never fully received. Others may have experienced neglect or abandonment, creating an ongoing need for security and reassurance in their adult relationships. These unmet needs can create a deep-seated yearning for something that feels like it is missing in our lives. When someone with such unmet emotional needs encounters another person who seems to fulfill these desires, whether through warmth, support, or the promise of intimacy, a powerful emotional attraction can develop. This person might represent for us a kind of emotional sanctuary. They provide the security, love, or validation we have longed for, even if only temporarily or partially. It is important to note that this type of emotional fulfillment may not necessarily come from a healthy or balanced dynamic. The desire for emotional fulfillment can be so strong that it overrides the reality of the relationship. We may become fixated on the person because they embody the potential solution to our internal sense of emotional lack. In this way, our obsession becomes less about who the person truly is and more about how they satisfy an emotional need within us. In relationships where there is an emotional imbalance, one where one person's needs are greater than the other's, obsession can manifest when the emotional void is not adequately addressed. For example, if a person has an overwhelming need for validation and affection, they may find themselves deeply fixated on someone who offers them these things, even if that person is not genuinely interested in a reciprocal relationship. The one offering validation becomes idealized, while the one receiving validation may be so emotionally dependent on it that they become unable to see the relationship for what it truly is. The relationship becomes less about genuine connection and more about the fulfillment of one's unmet needs. The emotional void, when unaddressed. In some cases, these emotional needs are linked to the archetypes we encounter in our lives, universal symbols or patterns that represent deeper aspects of the human experience. These archetypes, like the mother or the father, have profound significance in our psychological makeup. A person who evokes one of these archetypal roles may seem even more powerful and compelling because they represent something beyond individual personality traits. When we encounter someone who reminds us of these archetypal figures, whether it's a nurturing figure, a protector, a leader, or lover, they seem to hold the key to resolving our deepest emotional desires. The person becomes a symbolic representation of a role we are emotionally yearning for. Take, for example, someone who is seeking a mother figure, perhaps due to unresolved issues from their own relationship with their biological mother. If they encounter a person who is warm, nurturing, and attentive, they may become emotionally fixated on that individual, believing that this person holds the power to heal their emotional wounds. In this scenario, the obsession isn't with the person as they truly are, but with the archetype they represent. The emotional hunger for a mother figure is transferred onto this individual, and the obsession becomes a projection of this deep-seated need for care and nurturing. The need for emotional fulfillment in this case is so overwhelming that it obscures any critical perspective or objective understanding of the relationship. Instead of seeing the person as an individual with their own complexities, the person becomes an idealized symbol of emotional security. Similarly, someone who seeks a father figure might become deeply attached to someone who exhibits leadership qualities or strength. In this case, the need for guidance, authority, or protection becomes the driving force behind the obsession. The person they are fixated on may not be a perfect fit in terms of compatibility or emotional resonance, but they symbolize a resolution to the individual's unmet need for structure, direction, or safety. The obsession grows because the emotional need is so intense that it creates a sense of urgency, almost like a survival instinct, prompting the individual to hold onto the relationship or attachment as though their emotional well-being depends on it. Another significant emotional need that can drive obsession is the desire for validation. Many individuals grow up in environments where they are not consistently affirmed or recognized, leading them to develop a strong need for validation in adulthood. This need may manifest in relationships where one person's emotional dependence on validation makes them more likely to become obsessed with someone who provides it. When this emotional need is met, even temporarily, it creates a sense of relief and fulfillment, reinforcing the person's emotional attachment. The validation that comes from being seen, heard, and appreciated can be so powerful that it overrides all other factors in the relationship. The individual may overlook potential red flags or incompatibilities, fixating instead on the validation they receive from the other person. This dynamic is common in relationships where one person may act as the emotional giver, while the other becomes emotionally dependent on the validation provided. The emotional hunger for acknowledgement and acceptance can become so consuming that the person fixated on the other may ignore their own needs or desires in favor of receiving more attention and affirmation. However, the obsession created by unmet emotional needs is not always healthy or sustainable. Even if a person does find temporary emotional fulfillment in another individual, this sense of fulfillment may never be fully satisfying because emotional needs are complex and multifaceted. Validation, attention, or affection alone cannot provide long-term emotional well-being. The person who is emotionally fixated may eventually find that the need for fulfillment is never quite satisfied, even after they have received the attention they sought. This is where obsession can take a darker turn. The more the person seeks to have their needs met, the more they may become dependent on the individual, often losing sight of their own sense of self. The emotional hunger that drives them may lead them to become increasingly possessive, jealous, or controlling as they try to ensure that the relationship or attachment remains intact. In a healthy relationship, emotional needs are met. In a balanced and reciprocal manner, both individuals contribute to each other's emotional well-being, and the relationship is built on mutual respect, understanding, and emotional interdependence. However, when emotional needs become the sole driving force in the relationship, the dynamic becomes unbalanced, and the obsession with meeting those needs can lead to emotional manipulation, unhealthy attachment patterns, and the eventual unraveling of the relationship. The obsession in this case is rooted not in genuine love or affection, but in the desperate desire to fill an emotional void that can never truly be satisfied by another person alone. The idea of the shadow self is a concept deeply rooted in the psychology of human beings and plays a significant role in the way we interact with others, particularly when it comes to obsession and the intense emotional attachment we may feel towards certain individuals. The shadow, as it is often referred to, consists of the unconscious parts of our personality that we have repressed, denied, or failed to integrate into our conscious awareness. These are the aspects of ourselves that we often consider undesirable, unacceptable, or even threatening. Traits such as anger, jealousy, guilt, shame, or vulnerability. These emotions or characters may be so uncomfortable that we choose to push them into the depths of our psyche rather than face them. However, despite our best efforts to suppress them, the shadow self continues to influence our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, often in subtle and unacknowledged ways. When these hidden parts of ourselves remain unaddressed, they can manifest in our external relationships, especially when we are drawn to someone who mirrors or embodies these shadow aspects. In such cases, our obsession with another person may not be because we are attracted to them for who they are, but because they serve as a mirror reflecting the parts of ourselves that we have long ignored or repressed. At its core, the shadow represents the disowned, denied aspects of the self, those qualities we deem to be unworthy, undesirable, or incompatible with the persona we project to the world. These traits often include behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that we were taught to suppress, either by society or by early childhood experiences. Perhaps we were told not to express anger or sadness, or maybe we were punished for showing vulnerability or weakness. Over time, we internalize these messages, and as a result, we push these negative traits away, convincing ourselves that they have no place in our conscious identity. However, this repression does not make these traits go away. Instead, they exist in the unconscious, continuing to influence us from the background. When we encounter another person who embodies or reflects aspects of our shadow, it can evoke a strong, often irrational emotional response. The individual may exhibit behaviors or traits that we have long suppressed in ourselves, such as assertiveness, selfishness, or aggression, and this may provoke a sense of fascination, envy, or even fear. We may become drawn to these qualities in the other person because they represent something we have disowned within ourselves. This dynamic is particularly evident in relationships where we become fixated on someone who embodies qualities that we perceive as darker or more difficult to accept. For example, someone who has spent a lifetime suppressing their anger may find themselves drawn to someone who is openly expressive about their frustrations or who is unapologetically bold in their self-expression. In such cases, the obsession is not with the individual as they truly are, but with the aspects of the self that we see reflected in them, the parts of us that we have long buried. This connection between the shadow and obsession often stems from the fact that the parts of ourselves we repress are not inherently bad or evil. Rather, they are simply the aspects of us that we have learned to reject or suppress because they were not accepted or valued in our upbringing or society. In many cases, the shadow contains the energy and potential for growth, creativity, and transformation. However, these qualities are often difficult to access because they are buried beneath layers of fear, guilt, or shame. When we project these disowned aspects onto someone else, we create a distorted image of them, one that reflects our own unresolved issues, desires, and emotions. The individual becomes a mirror for our shadow, a person who embodies what we cannot accept or express in ourselves. This process of projection can lead to intense emotional reactions. When we see someone exhibiting traits that we have repressed, whether they are traits we envy or traits we fear, we may feel an emotional charge. The other person may trigger feelings of resentment, jealousy, admiration, or even anger. These emotions are not necessarily directed at the individual, but are in fact expressions of our own internal conflict. We may become obsessed with this person because they are, in a sense, carrying the weight of our repressed emotions. The obsession is a response to the challenge posed by the shadow. It is an unconscious attempt to confront the parts of ourselves that we have long ignored or the shadow can also manifest in relationships in the form of projection, where we place our unresolved emotions onto another person. In this dynamic, we perceive qualities in the other that are reflective of our own repressed traits or feelings. This projection is often unconscious, and we may be unaware that we are attributing our shadow to another. For example, a person who has repressed feelings of vulnerability may become obsessed with someone who is emotionally distant or unavailable. This fixation may be driven by a subconscious desire to confront their own vulnerability through the other person. The more we project our shadow onto someone else, the more we become fixated on them, because they are serving as the vessel for the unconscious parts of ourselves that we have yet to integrate. One of the most powerful aspects of obsession linked to the shadow is the unconscious desire for integration. While our shadow consists of traits that we have rejected or denied, these traits are not inherently harmful. In fact, they can be a source of personal power and growth if we are willing to confront and integrate them into our conscious awareness. However, this integration is not an easy process. It requires self-awareness, honesty, and the willingness to confront the parts of ourselves that we have long avoided. When we become obsessed with someone who embodies these repressed qualities, it may be an invitation from the unconscious to engage with our shadow and begin the process of integration. The obsession becomes a way for the unconscious to get our attention, to push us to explore the aspects of ourselves that we have disowned and are now projecting onto another person. This process of integration can be both transformative and challenging. It requires us to acknowledge the parts of ourselves that we have deemed unacceptable and to embrace them with compassion and understanding. For example, if we have repressed anger or aggression, we may find ourselves obsessing over someone who expresses these traits openly. The obsession is a reflection of our own internal struggle with these qualities. Instead of condemning them as bad, we must learn to accept and channel these emotions in healthy ways. By doing so, we can unlock new aspects of our personality and gain a deeper understanding of ourselves. The more we confront and integrate our shadow, the less power it holds over us, and the less we need to project it onto others. In relationships, this integration of the shadow can lead to greater authenticity and depth. When we acknowledge the parts of ourselves that we have repressed, we are better able to relate to others in a more genuine and balanced way. We stop seeing others as symbols of our unmet needs or unacknowledged desires, and instead we can begin to see them as individuals in their own right. The obsession fades as we integrate the shadow within ourselves, and our relationships become more authentic, grounded, and mutually fulfilling. However, the process of confronting and integrating the shadow is not without its challenges. It often requires facing the very aspects of ourselves that we have spent years avoiding or denying. It may involve feeling shame, guilt, or fear as we confront the parts of ourselves that we have rejected, but it is through this process that we can achieve greater wholeness and self-acceptance. By embracing our shadow, we can access new sources of strength, creativity, and emotional intelligence that were previously hidden from us. The obsession with another person fades as we no longer need to project our unresolved emotions onto them. We become whole, and in doing so, our relationships with others become more balanced and fulfilling. In conclusion, the obsession we feel toward others is not simply an external phenomenon. It is deeply rooted in our own psychological makeup, shaped by unconscious drives, unmet emotional needs, and the unresolved aspects of our inner world. Whether driven by projection, emotional hunger, or the pull of our shadow self, our fixation on others often reflects something within us that we are yet to fully understand or confront. These obsessions, while seemingly about the other person, are in reality about us, our desires, fears, and unresolved conflicts. By becoming aware of these underlying forces, we can begin to unravel the complexity of our emotional attachments and gain a deeper understanding of our own psyche. The journey toward self-awareness involves recognizing these projections, acknowledging the emotional needs that drive us, and facing the parts of ourselves that we have repressed or rejected. When we embrace this process of introspection and integration, we can transform obsessive patterns into opportunities for growth, healing, and more authentic connections with others. Rather than continuing to project our internal struggles onto external figures, we begin to accept and integrate all parts of ourselves, leading to greater emotional balance and healthier, more fulfilling relationships. Ultimately, obsession is not a reflection of the person we are fixated on, but of the parts of ourselves we have yet to understand and integrate. As we confront and heal these inner conflicts, we no longer need to project them outward, and we can experience life and relationships with greater clarity, authenticity, and peace.